In this video, we're going to show you how to install the CV axle on your INFINITI G37 X, located behind the driver's side wheel. Using a 21mm socket, loosen and remove your lug nuts. Now in our particular vehicle, we have a locking lug nut. We have the key to remove it. If you just have a standard lug nut, go ahead and take it off. Once you have those removed, remove the wheel and set it aside. Right in the center here, we have our axle shaft that comes through, and ours has a cotter pin on it. So you want to go ahead and remove that cotter pin. Now normally a cotter pin will have two legs on it that come through, and one of them gets snipped off upon installation. You can see I just popped that right out. There may be two of these legs here that come out. You just want to straighten those out and tap that out. This is a one-time use, so discard that. We will not be using that again. And the center axle nut is a 32mm. You want to go ahead and loosen and remove that. You can go ahead and dispose of that axle nut. Next thing you want to do is push on this axle shaft, see if it slips in. And it is not, so that means that the splines on our CV axle are stuck in our wheel hub. So you can take a mallet like this here, give that a few whacks. You can see that that's working its way in, which is good. We want to make sure that we can get this free from the wheel hub. If not, soak it down in some rust penetrant, let it set for a little bit, and then repeat the process. With the wheel removed, you now access the upper control arm right here. Now the ball joint goes through the knuckle here, and it's held in place by this 12mm bolt and nut as a pinch bolt application. We're going to use our 14mm socket on the nut side and a 14mm wrench on the other. Before we pull this apart, you want to have some sort of securing strap ready to go. I'm going to pull down on this upper control arm and then push that bolt out. The upper control arm may want to spring out. Hold on to the knuckle when this is happening. Now we don't want this to pull too far out. This is the reason for the securing strap. So use a securing strap and anchor it onto the body somewhere. With the knuckle supported, we now want to access the two bolts here that hold the upper control arm to the body of the vehicle. On the back portion of our strut here, we have our flex hose that comes up for our brakes, and they come up and join at this union. They use a 12mm socket. We want to go ahead and loosen and remove this nut. And then slide this off of the strut itself. On the back side of our knuckle here, you have an ABS wire that comes around and is connected in 4 different places. We need to disconnect those. Now, never grab the wire itself, but you can push up on the rubber grommet, slide that up and out just like so. And then the wire goes behind the knuckle to the front side of it. Let's go ahead and get to those. Grab this here, slide this out. And then we have 2 more on the back attached to the strut assembly. On the back side here, we have our clevis fork that attaches to the lower portion of our strut. Now there's a 14mm bolt right here. We need to loosen and remove that. I'm choosing to break this free with my ratchet, and then once it's loose, I'll switch over to a power tool to speed that up. Remove that bolt, set that aside. On the bottom of our clevis fork, we have a bolt and a nut right here. These are both 17mm. So I'm going to use my socket on this side here and my box and wrench on the other side just to hold that bolt in place. Once we get the nut off, we're going to go ahead and work that bolt out the other side. Now, for some reason, if that bolt is a little stuck, you can go ahead and take a hammer and just tap on the top of the clevis fork up here. That's going to slide it down off of the strut assembly, and it's going to give you a little bit more play to go ahead and get that bolt out. Underneath here, we have our sway bar end link attached to our sway bar and the lower control arm. We're going to use a 17mm socket to go ahead and loosen and remove the nut. I'll go ahead and slide that out and pivot it out of the way. Now, on the driver's side portion of our transmission, we have our CV axle coming through, and then it's bolted to a flange. Now, there's a series of 10mm bolts. There's 2 right here, and as we rotate the axle, there's going to be 2 more and then 2 more. So there's a total of 6 holding this in place. You want to use a 10mm wrench. Or a ratchet, and you want to get in there and loosen these. Now that we have these 2 loose, we want to go ahead and remove them. It's going to take you a little bit of time to get in there and get these out. There's one of the bolts there. I'm going to go ahead and remove the second one, and then we're going to go ahead and rotate that axle so we have access to the next 2 through the same area. All right, here's the second one here. Now what you want to do is go to the wheel hub area, and you're going to grab that rotor and you're going to rotate it until the next 2 show up. All right, and then repeat for these 2. And we're going to repeat that process for the last 2. Now that we have our last bolt out here, I'm going to go ahead and use a punch, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit this here. Just to separate that from the flange. Now this is separated, we're going to go back out to the knuckle side and work there. Our next step is to go ahead and loosen our securing strap. Hold that knuckle. I'm going to drop the securing strap down. I'm going to push our axle in. It's going to allow the knuckle to swing outward. The next step is we need to remove our clevis fork here off of the strut. So push down on that suspension, wiggle this off of our strut. Pull that up and off, set that aside. Now we can grab this axle. I'm going to do the same thing, push down on this control arm. Go ahead and grab that axle and pull it out. Take the new axle, I'm going to slide this in. And then we're just going to position our CV axle Flex that down and in. Insert the splined end into the back of the wheel hub and push the knuckle back up and in. Time to install our clevis fork. Feed that over the axle onto the control arm. Good, and get that lined up. Flex that control arm down. Work that in. So now we have our axle installed. We have our clevis fork lined up. We're going to install our upper control arm ball joint here. Get that bolt installed. We're just going to get that nut on there. We're just going to start that a few threads. Now that we have our axle in place here, we need to line up the holes on the axle flange to the flange on the transmission. How we're going to do that? Well, use one hand to lift up that axle. Use the other hand to rotate the brake rotor until that lines up. And then we'll feed our bolts in and get those started. Now that we have one started, we'll try and get the other one in. We should be able to rotate this. We'll get our next two in. We'll repeat this process until we get all of them installed. Now, when we installed our bolts, we put a little bit of blue Loctite on the threads here to make sure that these will stay secured. Using our 10mm, what you're gonna do when you're tightening these here is I'm gonna rotate the wheel end so I can get a good position on this. Now I got pretty much all of these tight already, but you want to get some good leverage on this here. Rotate that wheel and then tighten these down. You do want to make sure that these are good and tight. Do the same for the second one here. You want to evenly tighten these all the way around, making sure that the seat of the axle shaft is nice and flush up against that flange. You're gonna hold that wheel side and then tighten this. Make sure that's good and tight. And then you're gonna rotate it and do the same over here. Continue this process until everything is tight and fully bottomed out. You just want to make sure that these are all good and tight. Make sure that flange is seated. There's our last one here. These are all tight, and we did use our blue Loctite on the threads. Install your lower sway bar end link. Torque it down to 46 foot-pounds. Install our bolt into our clevis fork here. And pull down on your suspension and go ahead and get that hole to line up. Now that we have our bolt in, we'll install the nut on the other side. I'm not going to tighten down that nut yet. If we follow the clevis fork up, we have the upper pinch bolt that needs to be installed now. You want to go ahead and install your bolt into the clevis fork and get that started a few threads. Now, using my pocket screwdriver here, I'm pointing to where the clevis fork meets with the base of the strut. Now, this is a strut flange right here, and you want to make sure that there's no gap between this flange and the clevis fork. If there is a gap, put a jack underneath the suspension, underneath the control arm, jack it up until it closes up the gap. Then you can go ahead and tighten down our clevis fork bolt, and then we'll torque that. Go ahead and snug this down. Now we want to torque that down to 33 foot-pounds. Now, before we torque down our lower clevis fork bolt, what we need to do is compress our suspension into what we call a neutral ride height. This is basically if we had the wheel on the vehicle, lower down, and the suspension was compressed to where its neutral ride height would be. So in this case here, we're going to use our pole jack. You can use your floor jack. Compress your suspension until the vehicle just starts to come off of your lift or off of your stands. At that point there, we can go ahead and torque that down. Go ahead and tighten this down. Now we're going to torque this to 120 foot-pounds. Now if the bolt head is spinning like ours is, simply put your wrench on there and we're going to hold that. With it torqued, we can now go ahead and remove your jack. Install your ABS wire. Make sure you line up the tab or the notch with the bracket and push on the rubber. Don't push on the wire itself. We'll install the 3 here and then get the 4th one right on the other side of the knuckle. Install your flex hose. Now there is a little tab right here that this will catch on and lock it into place. Get that nut started. And we'll go ahead and snug that down. Snug down the upper bolt. Let's torque this down to 41 foot-pounds. Go ahead and install the axle nut. Now this axle nut does not require a cotter pin. It is dimpled in 3 points here. It's a self-locking nut. We're using a 36mm socket to tighten this down. Install 2 lug nuts side by side. And then we're going to lower the vehicle down close to the ground. Rotate that wheel. I'm going to use our lug nuts here to help us with some leverage. Go ahead and put your pry bar here. I'm going to torque down this axle nut to 92 foot-pounds. Now, our axle nut itself has dimpled edges to work it as a locking nut. You may have a cotter pin on your application. Simply install a new cotter pin, bend it over, snip off the access, remove your pry bar, and remove the lug nuts. At this point here, we can go ahead and raise up the vehicle and install your wheel. Go ahead and install your wheel. I'm going to go ahead and get all of our lug nuts started by hand. Once we get all of these started, we're going to go ahead and snug them down. We have our locking key. Go ahead and torque down your lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. We're going to use our locking key first. Then we'll continue with the rest in a crisscross pattern. And you're all set.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.